we're going to take a look at trying to wrap this up. So we're going to go through quite a few phases. The first thing that we need to do is I just want to come over to preferences, just so that if you're following along, we have a very similar setup, because I do have a few preferences changed. If we come down to navigation, I have orbit around selection enabled, and I also have zoom to mouse position. I find those to be very useful. If we come over to add-ons, I do have one add-on that I've recently been using called Synchronize Workspaces, and it allows you to switch tabs and maintain the view that you have in the current tab. You can go to gumroad.com and search for that and install it. It's free, and it's super neat. Let's get started. I'm going to select our body object, and we're going to take a look at the fact that I've got some other components in the scene, some basic components, so that we're all following along, some marker locations and so forth. I also have the cap modeled, and I have two versions, a closed cap and an open cap, that we're going to use. But we really need to come in here and just UV map this. That's our starting point. So I'm going to press the tab key, and I have made one minor change. I've created a bevel right here for a gold type of rim that's going to go around that as a design element. But otherwise, this is the same. So what we want to do is let's switch over here, and I'm actually going to turn off lights because they tend to kind of get in the way, all those markers. And we need to figure out what to do to unwrap this. We have this object that around the circumference is closed. It's open on the top and it's open on the bottom. I did delete the top faces. And we need to give it a seam that it can unwrap this. So I'm going to rotate around to the back. And if I double click this edge, I'm in polygon edit mode and I'm in edge mode here. If I double click this, it selects that entire loop. And we can use that by bringing up the context menu by right-clicking, and we're going to do a mark seam. And then on the bottom, I'm going to come right to about here, and I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to mark that as a seam, and then let's come to the top. And right here, I'm going to take that edge, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do a mark seam. And that is going to tell the UV mapper that we can basically lop the top off those little detail areas and not need to worry about them in the unwrap process. Let's come back into the front view. And let's switch over into UV edit mode. And this is where that synchronize workspace function really helps, because when I switch over here now, we have the same view. Otherwise, each view has its own independence, and you have to spend a lot of time trying to get those synchronized, the views synchronized. So again, when we look at this, the red indicates that those are seams. Purple indicates that those are actually hard edges. So it's the red that we're interested in. So what we need to do is I'm going to come back into the front. Perspective is turned off. Select all, press the A key. And then we're going to come over to the UV editor and we're going to tell it to unwrap. But before we do that, let's come down and take note that we just have a default UV map, and all the UVs that we see here are just default UVs that are generated during the modeling process, and then we're not going to use. Come over to UV and we're going to unwrap, and there it produces an unwrap for us. Now there's a slight angle to the island, and it's also not quite symmetrical. It's close, but it's not quite symmetrical. We're in edge mode, and I'm going to double click this central edge, press the S key and then X, and we're going to scale that. Press 0, and that will perfectly scale that so it's exactly perfectly aligned. Come over to vertex mode, bring up the context menu, and then we're going to pin those points, and we're going to use those as reference points to re-unwrap it. Let's come over here and deal with these. Let's just move these out of the way. Partially select, then press Command L, and then S key to sort of scale those. Those are sort of junk pieces we don't need. In face mode, I'm going to select all of these polygons, bring up the context menu, and then we're going to invoke unwrap again. And you can see how it reworks it using those pinpoints as reference. It couldn't move those, so everything else was rewrapped around those, producing a nice symmetrical re-unwrap. Now, press the period key and you can see that we're in bounding box center, and that's what we want, because If we come up here and open up our controls for the UV area, this selection is not quite centered, so I'm going to set this to 0.5, and that will get our UVs exactly in the center of the UV space, because the UV square is a 1.0 UV square, so 0.5 is halfway. And then vertically, I'm just going to manually move that so it's in the center, and then I'll press the S key to maybe increase the size just a little bit more. Now that we've gotten the UV map worked out, I'm going to press Tab key to leave edit mode. Let's come back over to layout, and we want to arrange this in our scene. And then we also want to apply some materials to this as a next step. If you look over here in the outliner, I've got a collection called Bottle. We've got the bottle, and I've got a cap closed and then a cap open. So for right now, let's go ahead and put just turn on the cap open, which we can see. Let me come over into the front, and we want to pose these in our scene. I've got another collection right here called Posed Bottles, where I just simply have a couple of, let's look at this in the top view, positions marked out by some empties. In fact, this empty is kind of huge. Let's change that. So the first thing that we need to do is take Bottle, and then we want to duplicate this into the position of these other empties. I actually want to take the cursor, the 3D cursor, and move it back to the center of the scene. Press Shift and S, and we're going to do cursor to world origin. That moves that back. Come over here and do an instance to scene, and it will put an instance of that collection in our scene. Again, this is pretty enormous, so let's set this back to something smaller, like 5 inches, because this is to scale. And then I'm going to press Option D, and I'm going to duplicate that. So we'll move that one there, and I'm going to take this one, and we'll move that one to this position. And this is just a position setting that I found to be useful. So Option D, move that there. So we'll end up turning off this main collection so that we've got this posing in the scene. Now, if we come back over here, what I want to do is I want to move all of these into that Posed Bottles collection so that I can turn those off and I can turn back on the original one. And we've got both of these enabled. I think there's actually a bug that causes this to get turned back on all the time. So let's come back over here and turn those on. So you can see that those are showing both of those bottle caps. I think there's a bug in the system that's making those not show up quite correctly, but that's okay because we're not going to use these instances as a final thing. But what I want to do is come over, and I'm going to take this one and I'm just going to rotate it so it's a little bit more interesting. We'll take this and rotate it, and then we'll take this and we'll rotate that. So we make some artistic decisions, and let's look at this through the camera. So I've already got a camera set up. We don't want the bottle cap to be open in all of them. Maybe just the one in the middle I want it open. But since we've got a single instance of what is happening here in the bottle, they're all going to be open. So how do we do this? Well, it turns out that we can actually take these and convert these not just to instances of the collection, but we can turn these back into instances of the individual components. So if you select that, come up to Object, and then we're going to come down to Apply, and then down here at the bottom it says Make Instances Real, and it's going to put instances of the original geometry that we can now customize. But you can see over here that it's just dropped those objects back into the collection in sort of a free-form way, but it's also put an empty right there that we can use. So I'm going to select, I'm going to hold the Command key, I believe that's Control on the PC, those 3 geometric components, grab these and then drop them on top of Bottle, but you have to hold the Shift key in order to parent them there. So now what we can do is turn off the closed, because I don't want the closed to appear in this middle one. So let's do the same thing over here. We're going to come over, Object, Apply, and we're going to do Make Instances Real. Okay, so let's select just these 3 components, move them, then hold the Shift key and drag them into Bottle 01. And we, in this case, want to turn off the open, and we want the closed to be there. In fact, I'm going to go ahead, for the sake of this demonstration and clarity, I'm going to press the X key and delete that, and I'm going to delete this just so that it's really clear what we're doing. Finally, this one here, we're going to come over, do the same thing, apply, make instances real. Take these three, I'm holding the command key, I'm on the Mac, that would be control on the PC. Hold the shift key, parent those to that empty, and then remove X key, the open one. Okay, so two of them are closed and one is opened. Now, the good thing is, if I come over here, I can press the tab key and I can come into edit for this geometry, and it will all link back to the original source geometry here in that bottle collection. So as an example, if I select here, you can see that they all link together. I'm going to press the escape key. The one downside, tab key to leave edit mode, is that if I were to come back into this main collection and I drop a new object in here, it won't propagate into these. But this is such a simple scene and is such a simple setting that this actually works pretty well as a mechanism. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to turn off these posed items and turn back on our primary bottle. Let's switch back into just a basic front view. You can also press the tilde key and select front, whatever your view is this way. I'm going to select this. Let's switch over into shading. I'm going to break this tall one right here, which I just have as a view manipulation. And I'm going to split horizontally right there, because then I can take this and turn this into the image editor. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But what I want to do is I've got bottle selected, this piece of geometry. We want to assign a material to it. But actually, let's do the cap first. Let's do the cap, because this will actually be a starting point for us. Since we're about to apply a material to this, since the other things are instances, the material change that we make here will propagate to those. So you can see that I already have bottle plastic, a material assigned to that. So that's going to be a starting point for us. And the material itself is sort of a plastic type of material. It's got a white base color, and we've got specularity set up to 4.425. That's a very common setting for slightly shiny, slightly reflective plastics. And then the roughness is 0.295, about 0.3. That's all we need to do. But you typically don't want to have just white as a color. You always want to have, if your material is going to have the appearance of white, you want it to actually have a slightly gray color. If you leave a full white, it's going to tend to blow out very easily. So we're going to use this as a starting point for the material that goes onto the body right here. So I'm going to select this, and I'm also going to assign the bottle white plastic to it. But we want this to become customized. So where it says 4, that means that material, that resource is applied to 4 different objects. I'm going to press that once in order to make it its own unique resource. So we're going to call this body label. And we're going to reutilize this right here. But we need to apply a material to it. So if we come over here, let's take a look at something really quick. If I look at preview, let's allow it to render the preview. You can see there's a little slight specular highlight, a little bit of reflectivity on top of this sort of white plastic material. So let's sort of remember that. We need to import a bitmap that I've already generated that was based off the UV map. So we're going to come to add and do image texture. And I'll drop that right there. And we're going to open in textures. It'll say bubbles label design. Click open. Okay, and there we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that up over in the image editor, and we can see what that is. Okay, so that conforms to the UV map that we've generated. Now, if we just simply come over here and assign this into the base color, The way that this is set up is that the white here is pure white. And what did I just say? I just said that you generally don't want to have a pure white base color. So what we have to do is we have to mix it against this so that the base will also match the base plastic that we're using for the caps. So I will detach that, and we're going to come to add down to color, and we're going to do mix color. And all we need to do is take each of these and drive these into the A and B slots like that. And we need to tell it, we're mixing the color, we need to tell it to go into multiply mode. And the multiply mode is exactly the same functionality as you would find in Photoshop, where the top color gets multiplied into the bottom color and it will darken the two. So this essentially becomes the base. But the trick here is that you don't want to leave factor at 0.5. I have a whole video where I talk about the significance of this factor and what this means, which I'll link to below if you really want to understand it. But for now, we're going to need to drive that up to 1.0, and that will give it a full multiply effect between these two layers. And then we take that and we drag it into base color. And now we can come over here into preview and we can take a look at that. So in order to visualize this, if I were to simply come over here and set that darker temporarily, you can see how the whole material becomes darker with that label bitmap multiplying against it. Let's come in now and preview this just in a texture bitmap preview mode, and you're going to notice that I goofed slightly. If I rotate this, looks like I did the back to the front and front to the back, but that's okay because we can take this and correct that. So I'm going to do this in polygon edit mode. Press the tab key, A key selects all of that. Let's come over to rotate, and let's just, so I'm going to make sure it's in the bounding box center, and let's just rotate that, type in 180. There we go. So that corrects that for us, my little goof. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to come in and let's turn off bottle and turn back on our arrangement. And those are there. And when we look at these, we can see that that material has propagated all the way across those. So that works really well. Let's come back over to layout mode. And we need to give this sort of a ground for our objects to sit on. So I have a collection called scene items. And we're going to come over and we're going to add a mesh, just a plane. Let's go ahead and make this 60 inches. Just a big plane, about like that. Command A will apply the scale, and we need to apply a material to it. And the first thing that we're going to do as far as a material, it's going to be a very basic material. So let's come over here, give it a slot. Let's create a new material to go into the slot, and we'll just call this ground. And we want the ground to be black. And we're simply going to reflect into it. And we're going to play with this in just a minute. So we're going to do a very basic setup, and we're going to leave specular at 0.5, and we're going to leave roughness at 0.5. So those are just going to be our defaults. Let's come back to one of our objects. So I'm going to select this object right there. You can do frame selected. Press the tab key. Now the change that we make here is going to propagate to the other ones, which is nice. There's a design element in face mode that we want to add to the top, which is like a metallic ring around the packaging. This was on the original packaging that I'm modeling this after. So I'm going to double click that, come back to the materials area here. We're going to add a new material slot, and we need to assign the slot to these selected polygons, and we're going to click new, and actually I already have that saved. The F means I've given that a fake user, so it's going to stick around. We'll just call that metal band. Has a base color of gold. It's set to fully metallic mode. And typically you just want to set specular up to 1.0. So that's pretty easy. Leave tab, and then when we look at this, we can see that the gold band is now there. Okay. So the next thing that we need to do is start setting up some lights so that we can begin doing some test renderings. I'm going to go back into a wireframe view. Let's come into the top. I want to turn off these empties right here, so just to sort of declutter the visible interface, because we're going to turn back on lights. And within that, I've got some other locations that I've sort of predetermined work really well for the lights. Now, the lights are going to model a very common 3-point lighting setup that's very, very common. You'll have like a rim light and a key light and a fill light. And so that's what we're going to model. We've got a primary light that we're going to use as sort of a side light to the left, at which I'm calling key light. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have us use a bona fide area light. So we're going to do Shift A to add into the scene. We're going to come down to light and we're going to do an area light. Now you see it went down here to where the cursor was, and that's okay. I'm going to select this, press Shift S, come to cursor to selected, and then I'll reselect this, do Shift S, and then selection to cursor. It's a little bit bigger than I want, so let's just make this say 4 inches and about like that. A decision that you can make is to rotate it and pose it like this, where we can come in and we can sort of, that's one way of posing it. But the other way that I really like is to have it aim at an object, and we'll do that with the other ones. But let's come over here first off, and you can see it says 10 watts, so that'll be a good starting point that we can work with. And then we have color. White for lights typically makes the scene look really antiseptic, and I'd really like this to follow a very common lighting setup where you've got a warm light and then you've got a complementary color like blue, and that's what we're going to do. Let's come back over into shading, and this is why I like that synchronized workspace function, because you see how it transports the view the way I had been working on, so it's predictable. We're going to come over to the object data properties for that area light, and we're going to switch over to use nodes. And the nice thing about this is it's going to give us the ability to do a predictable color temperature using a Blackbody. The strength is a multiplier against the value that we have right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to add, and we're going to do a black body, and we're going to tie this into color. The lower this value, the more reddish or orangish the color becomes. This is a physical value for lights that you can find online. We're going to start with a value of 3, which is still pretty low, but it's a really good starting point. Since we've gotten a single light in place, we can actually come in and test this. But one thing that you want to do is you do want to come over to the world properties and make sure that the default world property has a strength of 0. Since I have a camera in the scene already, let's go ahead and click the camera toggle, and I've already set us up to use cycles. And we can come over, press the N key, and we can test this. But I am going to tell you that one thing that I typically do is I typically make sure and set, I need to reset that back down to 1. Forgot about that. Under light paths, I'm going to set, I typically like to set diffuse and glossy to 5 as opposed to 4. And I usually set filter glossy down to 0 and indirect clamping up a little bit to 12. So those are pretty common settings that I always set. In fact, I have my files preset to do that, but I wanted to make you aware of those settings. So we're going to come up here and we're going to turn this on, and we're going to take a look at our starting point. So you can clearly see that we've got this key light here producing a lot of light. We've got our ground plane, and we've got a lot of bounced light coming from these areas. We have some really nice rim things going on here. So let's do this. Since we're here, let's make an adjustment. So the temperature of 3000 is pretty warm. Let's just take that up to 4000. So did you see that change? Made it a little bit less warm, but it still gives it just a little bit of that, the hint of that coloration. So let's come back into our main working environment. Layout. Let's come into the top view. And let's come over to this back one. Do Shift S, cursor to selected. we're going to introduce another light source here. But in this particular case, what I want to do is let's find where my light is. I want to put my lights in the correct location, and I dropped it into scene items, and I don't want it there. I want it inside of light. So we're going to take that and drop that properly here into lights. So with the lights collection selected, I'm going to press Shift A, and we're going to add, in this particular case, we're going to add a polygon mesh to operate as a light. It's going to be pretty enormous. Let's take this down to 15 inches. I think that's going to be good as far as an area light goes. What we're going to do with this is something a little bit different than what we did with the light over here. And we first need to kind of pose it so that it's aiming into the scene, because it's clearly not doing that right now. And you can see I've got a light target empty already in the position. It's just an empty that I've moved into the middle of the scene. And I want to take this, and we're going to call this light 2, something creative. And we're going to come down to constraints, which is right here. And we need to add a constraint called track to, and that's going to make it look at that empty. And then we need to tell it to target this light target empty. There you go. So that's a really nice thing, because now if I move that around, it stays targeted. And it's great for posing purposes. It just makes it very predictable. With this, we're going to set up another area light type of material, but this one's going to be a little bit different. So let's come back over into shading. I want to create a new material for this object. So let's create a new material slot, and we'll call this one Glow Panel 1 or something creative like that. And we want to come down and give it an emission, but we're going to do the same thing. We're going to give it an emission color based on a Blackbody. And in terms of the emission strength, let's just start with something kind of low, like a value of 2. So we'll come back over and we'll call this Blackbody. But this one we want to be pretty high. So 7,000 will be more into the lightish blue range. So that's the color I want for that. Okay, there we go. And that's all we need to do. In fact, you can turn off specular and roughness, all of those things, because they're not going to have any bearing on what we need this to be. So if we come over and let's enable our camera, and then we can preview this and we get a sense for what that's doing. Well, that's really nice. That produces a nice rim light. But in some situations, it may be that you want the effect of this light to be softer, especially if you've got a more sharply reflective surface and you don't want the hard boundary of this light to show up. So what we're going to do is add an image texture. I'll drop that down there, and we're going to open up a bitmap that I've already generated that's a fade. It's like a gradient that I created in Photoshop. It's very easy. Let's come over here and take a look at that. So we'll call that light fade. And that's all it is. I just use the gradient tool to create that so it blends out the edges. And we drive this into the alpha channel. And it's going to have the effect of reducing the amount of light coming from that. You can see it's dimmer, but it creates a more organic light, especially for, like I said, sharply reflective types of surfaces. In fact, if we were to come over here, let's move this temporarily back so that we can see it. Do you see the effect that has? I like using this technique. And from an artistic standpoint, heck, you may want to leave the light right there. In fact, let me just show you something. If you did want that to be back there, but you didn't want it showing in the camera, you could come down to Object Properties and you would go down to Visibility, and you would make ray visibility not visible directly to the camera. Okay, so just remember that's something in your arsenal. But I'm gonna undo, and I'm gonna move it back to where I kind of had it before. We're going to duplicate this now, so I'm going to do Option D, duplicate that there, select this, because this is sort of the fill. Shift S, cursor to selected, take this, Shift S, selection to cursor, And there we go. So we get a little bit more of a fill. So when we turn this off, I'm going to call this light 3 fill. So when we turn that off, you can see that's why it's called fill. In a 3-point lighting system, you might need that fill to be providing a lot more light. So if we come over here, let's come back down to the materials, and I want to select this back one. If I want that one to be a little bit brighter, then we would need to come down and make this become independent by pressing that 2. This material is assigned to this object and to this object. We only want it assigned to the back, so I'm going to press that. That becomes independent, and we'll call this rim, glow panel rim. And then we can come down here and let's give this a little bit brighter value, which is nice. So these are artistic decisions that you can begin to make in terms of how it is that you're wanting the visibility of your scene to appear. If you decide at this point that I think, well, I like the overall balance of what I'm seeing, but I still want it to be just a little bit brighter overall, this is where you would come in and you would make an exposure change, which is typically what would happen in traditional photography. So I'm going to come up here to render properties and we scroll down to where it says film. Let's bump this exposure up to 1.5 and that will brighten it up a little bit. Now, something to be aware of is that if you try and drive this too high, it's going to start making things look flat. And if we come down all the way to the bottom, you can see we have color management. By default, the view transform is what's called Filmic. And if we turn this off and we simply make it standard, do you see how there's a little bit more contrast? It's still using sRGB, so it's got 2.2 gamma applied, which is something we're not going to talk about here. But the Filmic has a way of reducing overly exposed areas and bringing those back down. So what you want to be careful of is that you're coming over trying to increase the brightness of your lights so high. And with Filmic coming turned on, it can make it difficult to continuously increase these lights because Filmic is going to continuously try and bring those values down into the visible gamut. So I typically will turn Filmic off temporarily while I'm making those light adjustments so I can see if I'm pushing too much light energy into the scene before I turn Filmic back on. Let's say that we kind of like this, we can certainly come over and play with the position of our lights and so forth, but I want to turn my attention to the ground next. Now for the ground, I think the ground needs to be a little bit more interesting. If we take a look at the material for the ground, the material is being governed by let's first point something out. If you're new to materials, this can be a little bit confusing. We're seeing a lot of ground, but our base color is black. All of the reflectance is happening right now through the specular channel. Specular is just a way of saying reflections. If we were to come over and turn on the base color to something like light gray, well, we've suddenly got this overpowering ground, and that's not what I'm wanting. I'm wanting something a little bit more interesting. So we're getting the combination of both the specular and the base color, and I don't want that. So I'm going to take this back here, but let's say that we want sharper reflections. So I'm going to take this down way lower down there so that we've got these much sharper reflections. But at a glancing angle, let's take a look at this from the left view and let's understand what's happening. This is our camera, and our camera has a very low view angle relative to the surface that's being reflected right here. And that means we're going to have a high degree of reflectivity because the Fresnel effect that governs the specular channel says that as your incidence angle increases, reflectivity increases. So what is incidence angle? Incidence angle is an angle that measured between the line of sight of a camera to a point that it intersects on that surface and a surface normal at that point. And then when you measure the angle between those two parts, if that angle is relatively high, you'll have a high degree of reflectivity. So that's why we're having a high degree of reflectivity. And we're going to talk about this for a minute because this is something that I've run into with clients actually asking me to make adjustments for this exact scenario. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make it so that we still have a little bit more of the ephemeral nature of a slightly rough surface mixed in with this. So we need to add another layer here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and move this primary principled BSDF over to the side, and I'm going to copy that. In fact, I'm going to turn that off temporarily. Let's paste that and put the copy here. So on this one, if I come over and let's turn roughness back up to about 0.5, and we drive it back over into the surface output, then we get pretty close to what it was that we were looking at before. It becomes to act like a very diffuse type of surface, but not quite fully diffuse. So what I'm going to do is detach that and add a mix shader. The mix shader comes here. The mix shader is what goes into the final output. And we take these two components, the sharp one here and the rougher one up here, and then we mix those together equally. And we turn this on, we get a mix between those two surfaces. What if we still determine and we still think that that's a little bit too reflective? We can bias this. For instance, if I take the factor here and bring it closer to 0, it's going to bias it towards this top rougher shader. So if we take this to 0.25, we get that. If I take it to 0.75, it biases it towards the sharper view. Well, that's great because it's minimized this, but I kind of like having it. So the first thing is I do think that the roughness here is a little bit too high. So I'm going to bring that down. And I kind of like it about like that. Okay. So we don't see anything happening from the background, but we still get a little bit of the extra reflectance of that second property. But overall, it's still too reflective. So Blender does not give you the ability in the material system to control the high degree of reflectivity at these upper glancing angles. It doesn't give you what we call an incidence 90 control. Some other renderers do, Blender doesn't in the material system, but we can work around that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to copy this mix shader. I'm going to copy that, paste it, and I'll move that up here temporarily. Give it some room. Let's return that to a value of 0.5. Now, we're going to drive this mix shader into it, and then we're going to drive this into the final output. But we're not going to put another shader function into that. So all it has to work with is nothingness, is black. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that these reflections are not quite so strong. And you see what happens is that gives us the ability to pop our what we call hero objects up above the reflections. If I were to drive this back in over here, do you see those become brighter? And it's like, oh, those are maybe a little bit too bright. So I can drive that one in and it mutes those down a little bit and pops our objects off the background. So we've arrived at the end point, and I hope you found this to be a good and useful tutorial.